After World War II ended, countries across the globe began to break free from British control and regain their independence. In Iran, people took to the streets in a massive wave of protest against their own monarchy. They were desperate to overthrow a system of rule that had been in place for centuries. At the time, Iran was ruled by King Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. But the reality was that Britain and the Soviet Union were pulling the strings from behind the scenes. They were playing a high-stakes game for power and oil, both entangled in the conflict and lured by the immense profits. Desperate for a bigger piece of the pie, they would stop at nothing. Seeing the incredible potential for profit, the United States joined the power play as well. The Iranian Revolution is unique in world history. Just as they succeeded in toppling the monarchy, the Iranian people chose to transform their nation into an Islamic Republic. At a time when the rest of the world was pushing for democracy, Iran was locked in a bloody struggle to establish an Islamic regime. This Islamic revolution would completely reshape the Middle East, and its impact would be felt for decades. In the early 20th century, Iran was under the control of the Qajar dynasty. The people suffered in silence under the king's absolute rule, forced to obey his every command. Pushed to the breaking point by years of oppression, they finally began to unite and resist the king's reign. The public issued a clear demand: establish a parliament and allow ordinary people to participate in governing the country. At the time, Shia Muslims were the majority in Iran, and they hoped to make Shia Islam the state religion. Terrified by the sight of thousands of citizens rising up together, the king, Mozaffar ad-Din Shah, finally gave in to their demands. In 1906, Iran became a constitutional monarchy, limiting the king's power. Following the reforms, Shia Islam was declared the official state religion, and a parliament was established. The people also elected a prime minister. And while the king still held some power, any decision he made now had to be approved by the parliament and its elected officials. Change was underway in Iran. For the first time, the people saw the dawn of a modern society and were gratified to have finally won a measure of power for themselves. A period of calm settled over the nation. However, this peace and reform wouldn't last long. On March 1, 1907, Mozaffar ad-Din Shah Qajar passed away, and his son, Muhammad Ali Shah Qajar, inherited the throne. Almost immediately after ascending, Ali Shah dismantled all of his father's reforms. He refused to recognize the constitution, dissolved the parliament, and marginalized the elected prime minister and his representatives. His dictatorial rule plunged Iran back into darkness. Britain and Russia openly supported Ali Shah's actions. This blatant foreign interference enraged the Iranian people, who were already deeply resentful of outsiders meddling in their affairs. The very people who had championed the constitutional reforms organized once again. Gathering in Tehran, they were determined to overthrow the new king. Another uprising exploded across Iran, and Ali Shah was forced to abdicate. The rebels declared his young son, Ahmad Shah Qajar, the new king. In 1909, Iran's constitution was officially re-established, but Britain and Russia were still eyeing Iran covetously. For centuries, the two empires had been locked in a rivalry for dominance in Central Asia and Persia, and their competition was far from over. Both dreamed of installing a puppet government to control the nation and exploit its resources. Although the recent regime changes had weakened their grip, they were merely waiting for an opportunity to seize control once more. That opportunity came in 1914 with the outbreak of World War I, which pitted the world's great powers against each other in two major blocks. After 5 years of brutal fighting, the war ended in 1919. Britain and Russia were on the winning side. However, the war had drained Britain's resources, and it desperately needed money to rebuild its economy. Its eyes turned to Iran's vast reserves of oil and natural gas. Britain had previously made enormous profits from selling Iranian oil. But the recent changes in government had cost them their monopoly. And so, the British began plotting to overthrow the government of Ahmad Shah Qajar. In 1921, with the backing of a commander in the Iranian army, Reza Khan, Britain successfully launched a coup. The Qajar dynasty was brought to a decisive end, and Iran continued as a constitutional monarchy. Although the parliament did not initially approve of Reza Khan, the National Assembly officially appointed him the new king of Iran in 1925. Upon taking the throne, Reza Khan established the Pahlavi dynasty and would henceforth be known by the name Reza Shah Pahlavi. For a long time, Persia had been a pawn in the geopolitical games between Britain and Russia. After a massive oil discovery in 1901, Britain's desire to control the country's resources grew even stronger. On April 14, 1909, the Anglo-Persian Oil Company was formed. By 1914, the British government had become the majority shareholder, giving it a complete monopoly over the extraction, refinement, and sale of Iranian oil. While Britain raked in immense profits from this trade, Iran received a meager share, only 16% of the profits. This was a source of extreme resentment among the Iranian people. They hoped Reza Shah would negotiate with the British for a bigger cut. But as Britain's puppet, the Shah was more concerned with securing his own power than fighting over oil revenues. Reza Shah began to overhaul many of Iran's long-standing traditions. He introduced sweeping reforms in education and law, specifically designed to weaken the influence of the clergy in society. The judicial power, which had once been held by Shia religious courts, was gradually replaced by a system of secular courts. The Shah also championed education, establishing a network of schools and colleges across the country, culminating in the founding of the University of Tehran in 1934. Reza Shah advocated for women to participate equally in society. At the time, Iranian women faced many restrictions, such as being required to wear a headscarf in public. To force a change, he launched a controversial unveiling campaign in 1936, which banned the veil entirely. He also raised the legal age of marriage and reformed divorce laws to better protect women's rights. These measures significantly improved the status of women in Iran. At the same time, as Reza Shah tried to build a secular government, he grew more authoritarian. He banned trade unions and other political parties. He either shut down newspapers that criticized him or forced them to become state mouthpieces. Throughout these changes, the clergy grew increasingly resentful of their diminishing influence in society. They fiercely opposed the Shah's modernization efforts and the new rights granted to women. But intoxicated with power, Reza Shah paid them no mind, using the strength of his British-backed position to crush any and all dissent. The Shah also attempted to reduce Britain's and the Soviet Union's influence over Iran. In the 1930s, he began to foster trade relations with Germany, and by 1938, Germany had become Iran's largest trading partner. However, the global landscape shifted dramatically in 1939 with the outbreak of World War II. The Soviet Union, Britain, and the United States formed an alliance to fight Germany. Both the Soviets and the British coveted Iran's oil resources. They feared Germany could seize the oil to fuel its war machine and were terrified that Iran's critical Abadan refinery, the largest in the world, might fall into German hands. After all, the Allies had every intention of using Iran's oil for their own war effort. Furthermore, Iran's strategic location was critical for the Allied war effort. They needed to use the country as a Persian corridor to transport American weapons and supplies to the Soviet Union. Concerned about the security of these shipments, the Soviets and the British took a hard line, demanding that Reza Shah expel all German nationals from Iran. The Shah refused. It was a decision that would cost him dearly. In 1941, he was forced to abdicate. His son, Mohammad Reza Shah, became the new king of Iran. Immediately after taking power, The new Shah abolished his father's mandatory unveiling policy, giving women the freedom to choose their own attire. A new era of openness seemed to be dawning. Economic activity picked up, and restrictions on the press, publishing, and political organizing were lifted. Numerous political parties emerged, including the National Will Party, which was backed by the British, and the Communist Tudeh Party, supported by the Soviets. But Iran was still a constitutional monarchy in name only. The prime minister and other representatives were mostly loyalists to the Shah, which led to intense public dissatisfaction. The people demanded fair elections to choose their own leaders. Facing a tide of popular anger, the king was forced to hold elections in 1951. On April 28, following the election, Mohammad Mossadegh became the new prime minister of Iran. As his very first act, Mossadegh nationalized all of Iran's oil resources, shattering Britain's long-held monopoly. Britain was furious and retaliated with crippling economic sanctions. It also took the case to the International Court of Justice, which ultimately ruled against Britain, declaring it had no jurisdiction. The decision was a stunning victory. The Iranian people erupted in celebration, and Mossadegh was hailed as a national hero. But Britain was more determined than ever to overthrow him. When Mossadegh learned of Britain's plots, he declared the UK an enemy state in October 1952 and severed all diplomatic ties. Unable to solve the problem on its own, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill turned to the United States for help. Placing a call to President Harry S. Truman, he hoped for American military intervention in Iran, but the Truman administration refused. Churchill, however, didn't have to wait long. In the 1952 U.S. presidential election, Dwight D. Eisenhower was victorious. With the new administration came a complete reversal in American policy toward Iran. The U.S. Central Intelligence Agency, CIA, teamed up with Britain's MI6 on a mission to overthrow Mossadegh. On August 15, 1953, the CIA made its move, but the initial coup attempt failed. The Shah was even forced to flee to Italy in the chaos. The agency didn't give up. On August 19, 1953, they launched a second attempt, successfully arresting Mossadegh and removing him from power. In a plot orchestrated jointly by Britain and the United States, Mohammad Reza Shah was reinstalled as the absolute monarch of Iran, and he quickly appointed a prime minister of his own choosing. This ordeal taught the Shah a lesson. It was impossible to rule the country without modernizing it. But he also knew his throne was secure only thanks to American support, which meant he now had to follow Washington's lead on many issues. As American influence grew, the Soviet Union's power in Iran faded. The U.S. had replaced the Soviets as the dominant foreign power. In 1957, with help from American and Israeli intelligence agencies, the Shah established a secret police force, the Organization of National Security and Information, better known as SAVAK. Through this feared organization, the Shah brutally suppressed anyone who opposed him, and SAVAK became a symbol of terror throughout Iranian society. The people began to feel that the Shah was turning Iran into a colony of the United States. By the 1960s, opposition to the king was widespread and growing. To quell the dissent and win the support of farmers and the middle class, the Shah launched the White Revolution in 1963. It was a sweeping, top-down effort to modernize every aspect of the country, a program he hoped would transform Iran into a global power. During the White Revolution, Iran did achieve significant progress. A nationwide land reform program was launched. Forests were nationalized, and the government pushed forward with the construction of new factories and infrastructure. The oil industry developed rapidly, and as Iran's share of the oil revenue increased, so did its economic power. During this period, Mohammad Reza Shah also took significant steps for Iranian women. He not only gave them the right to vote but also opened numerous coeducational schools and colleges where men and women could study side by side. However, the Shah's reforms were not popular with Iran's conservative factions. They accused the king of destroying the nation's traditional culture. Some Orthodox Muslims still believed the country should be governed according to Islamic law. Public opposition wasn't just aimed at the new rights for women or the westernization of Iran. It was also because the White Revolution, for all its developmental successes, primarily benefited the wealthy elite. Ordinary people and the middle class remained poor, struggling to get by. Prices were constantly rising, and young people faced a severe unemployment crisis. Soon, Iran's youth also took to the streets, openly protesting against the government and the king. At the same time, the influence of a religious leader named Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini was growing daily. He fiercely opposed the king's policies on women's rights and argued that Iran should be governed by Islamic principles. He condemned the White Revolution, viewing it as a tool for promoting Western culture. Furthermore, Khomeini accused the king of abusing his power, and in 1963, he issued a declaration denouncing the Shah's entire program, a statement that was co-signed by 8 other senior religious scholars. Because Shia Muslims were the majority in Iran, Khomeini quickly gained a massive following. This deeply worried Mohammad Reza Shah and his prime minister, Hassan Ali Mansur. Khomeini was arrested and thrown in prison. After a period of time, he was released, but he was immediately exiled from Iran, forced to relocate to neighboring Iraq. Khomeini did not stop speaking out. Through interviews and recorded speeches that were smuggled back into Iran, he maintained close contact with the people. He laid out his vision to rule Iran under the principle of the guardianship of the Islamic jurist, creating a nation governed by God, where experts in Islamic law would act as divine guardians. This, he argued, would eliminate the gap between the rich and poor and create a society of true equals. Khomeini's ideology resonated with many, and people flocked to his cause, becoming his staunchest supporters. His influence in Iran grew larger every day. Eventually, Khomeini's powerful presence drew the ire of Iraq's own ruler, Saddam Hussein, and after a few years, he was exiled from Iraq as well. Back in Iran, the Shah's autocratic rule grew even harsher. In 1971, to mark the 500th anniversary of the Persian Empire, the Shah decided to throw a monumental celebration. Ignoring the advice of his counselors, he chose to host the event in the remote desert, near the tomb of the empire's first emperor, Cyrus the Great. To prepare, the Shah's government invested staggering sums of money, building 600 kilometers of new roads and erecting a luxurious tent city adorned with silk. With tableware and master chefs flown in from Europe, the party lasted for 3 days, attracting guests from all over the world. Many international magazines called it the most lavish party in history. It's estimated the Shah spent over $100 million, equivalent to 55 billion rials at the time. This obscene extravagance, while his people suffered, triggered a firestorm of criticism from the media and the public. The Shah ignored it completely. In 1975, he doubled down. He had the leaders of all opposition parties thrown in prison and officially banned every political party in the country except for his own, cementing his absolute power. He also imposed strict censorship on the media. For nearly 2 years, anyone who dared to criticize the king was thrown in prison. This tyrannical rule caused the people's anger to build and build, until it finally exploded in 1977. Protesters poured into the streets, demanding an end to the king's reign. University students were at the forefront, openly chanting slogans against the government and the Shah. Then, on October 23, 1977, Khomeini's eldest son, Mustafa, died under mysterious circumstances. Protesters immediately accused the Shah of ordering his assassination. The event enraged the public. Mourning ceremonies were held across the country, serving to unite the people further as the calls for the Shah to step down grew even louder. On January 7, 1978, the Iranian newspaper Etala published an article titled, "Iran and Red and Black Colonialism." The piece, written at the instigation of the Shah's government, slandered Khomeini, calling him a British agent. By this time, Khomeini was a national hero, and the article was a fatal miscalculation that infuriated his supporters. Millions of Khomeini's followers surged through the streets of Tehran in protest. The crowds even attempted to storm the king's palace. When security forces moved in to disperse them with force, the once peaceful protests turned violent and radical. Police opened fire on the demonstrators, killing more than 300 people. But the massacre didn't stop the protests, it only fueled them. The demonstrations in Tehran grew more intense, becoming a daily occurrence. For every person killed, more protesters rose up to take their place. Shortly after, an event occurred that would shock the entire nation to its core. On August 19, 1978, 4 extremists barred the doors and set fire to the Cinema Rex, burning to death the hundreds of people trapped inside. The fire killed more than 400 people trapped inside. The event put the Shah in an impossible position. Khomeini immediately accused the king and his secret police of being the masterminds behind the attack. In the supercharged atmosphere of anti-government fury, the public was ready to believe it. They were convinced the king and his police were the true culprits behind the horrific tragedy. This attack became the final trigger for the Iranian Revolution. In its aftermath, tens of thousands of people poured into the streets with a single goal: to overthrow the king. They chanted, "Burn the Shah, the real culprit." Though the protests were temporarily brought under control, a massive demonstration was planned for the upcoming Eid al-Fitr on September 4, 1978. The festival marking the end of Ramadan was the perfect opportunity for protesters to gather in huge numbers and shake the foundations of the king's rule. As planned, nearly 500,000 people gathered in the city's main square that day. They fiercely condemned the Shah and, for the first time, openly called for Ayatollah Khomeini to return to Iran. Seeing the sheer scale of the Eid protests, the Shah panicked. On September 8, he declared martial law, stripping citizens of their basic rights, banning all demonstrations, and imposing curfews across the country. But about 5,000 people defied the order, flooding into Jala Square to protest. Police repeatedly warned the crowd to disperse, but they refused to back down. Finally, the police opened fire. Initial reports counted 64 dead. As the day went on, the death toll climbed to 89. In the history of the Iranian Revolution, this day would forever be known as Black Friday. In Jala Square, under the guns of the Shah's police, so many lost their lives. But the popular movement to oust the king did not stop there. In December of 1978, during the Islamic month of Muharram, a deeply symbolic period of mourning and protest against injustice in Shia Islam, the opposition planned a final wave of demonstrations. This time, the people were determined to drive the king from his throne for good. Hundreds of thousands, then millions, once again took to the streets. The protests raged for months. The police tried to control the situation, but after years of constant conflict, they were exhausted and their morale had collapsed. Throughout this period, the United States stood firmly by the Shah, even declaring it would provide military support if necessary. This American backing, however, didn't intimidate the Iranian people. It only made them more furious. Protesters burned American flags across the country, shouting, "The Shah is America's puppet. Down with the Shah." Seeing the uncontrollable rage of the people, the king was terrified. On January 16, 1979, under the pretext of seeking medical treatment, he fled Iran for the United States. The moment the king left, massive celebrations erupted across the country. The people tore down and destroyed every statue. every portrait, and every symbol associated with the monarchy. In February 1979, after 15 years in exile, Ayatollah Khomeini finally returned. Millions of Iranians poured onto the streets to greet him in a welcome fit for a king. The crowds were so enormous and ecstatic that they were almost impossible to control. As soon as he arrived, Khomeini moved to consolidate his power. He officially dismantled the monarchy and dismissed all officials appointed by the Shah. In the revolution, various leftist and moderate groups had also played a part. They had hoped that overthrowing the Shah's autocratic regime would lead to the establishment of a democracy in Iran. But Khomeini, wanting no obstacles to his own rule, gradually pushed them all aside. In March of 1979, a national vote was held to approve a new constitution. The results were overwhelming. More than 98% of voters supported the change. The new constitution officially declared Iran an Islamic Republic. It also mandated parliamentary and presidential elections. However, the constitution also created the new position of supreme leader. The supreme leader is the most powerful person in Iran. He has the authority to veto any decision made by the parliament or the president and holds the power to appoint the judges of the Supreme Court and the commanders of the armed forces. With these powers, Ruhollah Khomeini became the first supreme leader of Iran. Under the new constitution, Iran was declared to be under the rule of Islamic Sharia law. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, IRGC, was also established, with its primary duties being to protect the supreme leader and enforce the new constitutional order. From that day to this, Iran has remained an Islamic republic, governed according to the principles of Islamic law.